Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar on our Home Matters Day policy priorities. I'll be turning the webinar over now to Lavana Leyendecker.
Thanks, Colleen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are really excited to get ready for Home Matters Day 2018. We have a lot of folks signed up and registered, and we have some really great new policy proposals that we are going to be talking about this year. So let me just walk through what we're going to talk about today, and we want to make sure to leave lots of room at the end for questions from you all. So first we want to talk about why we do Home Matters Day and what will happen before Home Matters Day, what will happen on the day, what we'll be doing to follow up, and then we'll get all of your questions. So this goes without saying, but I just want to make sure that we're all centering around the reason why we're gathered here together. And increasing state resources for affordable housing will certainly benefit all of our communities and clients. And that's our goal here, is to increase resources and give people more tools to create more affordable housing in the state. And we know that from all of the successes of the Housing Alliance and all the work that you all have done in the past, we know that when we do advocacy right, it works and gives us the opportunities to solve some of the big problems that we all get out there to solve every day. And our focus this year is on two main programs. First is a new policy proposal, which is to create a new state housing tax credit. Many of you probably understand and know about the federal low-income housing tax credit. And what we want to do is pass legislation to create a new state housing tax credit that would supplement the federal low-income housing tax credit and open up more resources for affordable housing. Secondly, we want to continue to protect and expand PHARE resources. PHARE has been such a great program in terms of providing housing services and reducing blight all around the state, and we want to make sure that we continue to do work to protect those resources and talk about ways that we could potentially expand them in the future. And then we want to share stories of how housing resources really make a difference in our community. And if you had more resources, what would you do with them? And that's what we want to talk to legislators about when we go to Harrisburg for Home Matters Day on June 5th. So there are a couple of different opportunities that we are going to ask when we go to Harrisburg. We're going to ask our legislators to do. They're slightly different for senators than they are for representatives, because we will have a bill, an actual state housing tax credit piece of legislation in the Senate, but we will not in the House right away. So the first thing we will ask our senators to do is to become a co-sponsor of the state housing tax credit legislation. Next on the agenda, we're going to review over the more details about what the state housing tax credit legislation will do. But I just want to make sure everyone understands that we primarily are going to be meeting with senators, and we're going to be asking them to co-sponsor that legislation. And then we'll be telling them about how PHARE is used in our communities, or how you would use PHARE funding if you had the opportunity to receive it in your community. For representatives, we will be talking to them about PHARE in the same way, and we will just ask them to support state housing tax credit legislation when it reaches the House. That probably won't happen until a little bit after Home Matters Day, but we want to introduce them to the concept, educate them about it, so that they'll be ready when legislation is available in the House. So the first thing I want to say about a state housing tax credit, for those of you who are not as familiar with the technical details about how tax credits work, is that you don't have to understand everything about how it works in order to be a good advocate on why expanding resources makes sense. So the two things that you definitely need to understand are just that the state housing tax credit will mimic the federal low-income housing tax credit, which is currently the main vehicle for creating affordable rental housing in the United States. There is much higher demand than there is supply of federal housing tax credits, and so that's why the state housing tax credit will make a big difference in Pennsylvania, because it will help to create more resources to fulfill that demand. And what it will do, it will mirror, like I said, the federal credit and provide dollar-for-dollar reduction in the state tax liability in exchange for providing financing to develop affordable rental housing in the state. And so now I'd actually like to call on our guest speaker, Matt, who will, he is from LISC, and he's going to be talking to us about the details of the proposal and how it will work in the state of Pennsylvania. So Matt, if you are unmuted, you can go ahead. You can press *7 to unmute yourself if you're not.
I am using the web app, so hopefully you can hear me.
Great, yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. So just to give a quick overview of the Pennsylvania State LIHTC program that we are proposing, essentially what we are trying to do is mirror the federal low-income housing tax credit program on a statewide level, allowing us to create a new source of subsidy to create additional affordable housing units. Right now, the federal low-income housing tax credit program is a 10-year tax credit. We are proposing a 5-year tax credit. So just on the front end, before I walk through how the cycle will work, if a $2 million, just for instance, allocation of state low-income housing tax credits is approved, we can assume somewhere, from a budget perspective, over that 5-year period, 2 times 5, a $10 million impact to the state budget. What that means in equity to a project is going to be defined by the market and the pricing for each individual tax credit. So if we just take a moment to talk about how the life cycle of the credit will work, the state, through its normal tax credit RFP process and using the same project guidelines and mandates that it outlines in its Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP, every year, will issue a RFP or a request for proposals for projects seeking subsidy and or low-income housing tax credits for their project. And we envision that requesting these funds will go through that same process. So the standards for the Pennsylvania tax credit will mirror the federal low-income housing tax credit program. What does that mean? It means that we are allowing for up to 80% AMI. This is based on a new income averaging paradigm introduced in the omnibus passed in the beginning of the year. And the overall program income targeting requires that in any 1 year, 10 to 30% of the allocation goes to target units at or below 30% of AMI. All right, so this is this mirrors what the federal LIHTC program already says. Now, we are looking to bifurcate from the federal credit and allow for the tax credit to be sold to a separate investor. The state tax credit only has value to corporations and entities with state level tax obligations. And so often the investor for federal tax credits and state tax credits have different investors, and this can be a problem where the credit is not bifurcated. We are recommending that the bifurcation of the credit to allow us to admit 2 partners into the deal one with a very, very small percentage stake in the deal to be able to get that second source of equity into the project. That ultimately means higher price per credit to the investor because the investor has those tax obligations. We are also asking to allow for the certification of the program, which is essentially allowing the state credit to be sold to an investor not buying an ownership percentage into the project, and essentially passing it along as a bearer note, if you will, a bearer bond that can be cashed essentially on a tax return. This process allows for a wider investor pool, but for-profit investors, this does come with some tax implications, and so the certification process is something that will have to be talked about with your individual investor or syndicator. The recapture period of the credit mimics the current federal LIHTC program as a 15-year recapture period and a 35-year compliance period. Essentially, any part of the federal LIHTC is subject to recapture during that 15-year period of the initial LIHTC investment, and the state credit is going to mirror that. In the cases of any renting to tenants, that are not eligible for the program. And as I mentioned earlier, we're asking for a credit period of 5 years. So essentially, if you are given a $1 million allocation to your project, that equals $5 million over 5 years, and that's what you're selling to your end investor. But the federal credit is a 10-year credit, so it is half the equity of over the period of 5 years that a federal credit would deliver over time. So that is a very broad view of what we are proposing. I'm going to stick around for any questions and answers, and I'm happy if any of this is too wonky. Please know if anybody wants me to try and boil this down, and I'll be happy to do so.
Great, thanks, Matt. I know that it is complicated for people who are not familiar with how tax credits work, but for those of you who work with tax credits and do this often, I think this gives a good overview of the basics of how the tax credit program will work. I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the process of how this legislation will move forward, and then we'll also open up for questions at the end that people have about the program. So currently the legislation is being written. It will be introduced actually the day after Home Matters Day on June 6th, but we will have a bill number that we've reserved that we'll be able to talk about on Home Matters Day, June 5th. The reason why we're holding off on introducing it to the next day is because we want to spend the day of June 5th asking people to co-sponsor the legislation so that they can be part of that original list. The legislation will be introduced by Senator Killian, who announced this proposal at our Home Matters Day conference last year in November. And then finally, I just want to say that to talk a little bit about how this relates to the PHARE funding. So what this will allow is for funding to be dedicated to affordable rental housing in the state, and that will free up current money that is in the PHARE program to be dedicated to other uses. So PHARE has a long list of uses like supportive housing services and counseling, as well as home ownership that the funding can be used for. And by creating a state housing tax credit that's dedicated to affordable rental housing, what we're doing is we're allowing more an expansion of the current funding that's going to PHARE to go towards the more diverse list of uses. Currently, we are spending The state is spending as much as it can on PHARE. They just, in 2018, allocated $26.6 million to PHARE projects around the state, and that's about at how much it is capped at. So by creating the Fair Housing Tax Credit, we can allow that flexible funding to go towards more projects around the state in coming years. So I'm going to pause there for a minute, and people can definitely type your questions into the Q&A, and I will answer those as we move forward, and then we'll also open it up to questions on the end. Just to talk a little bit about the logistics, actually I'm going to turn it over to Colleen, who has been putting the logistics together, and she's going to walk through how that will work for everyone while I address some of the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alana. So the Housing Alliance has been working with those who have registered already for Home Matters Day to schedule appointments with your senators. We are looking to schedule meetings between 10:30 and 12, and we'll be preparing the packets for those meetings. And we're organizing teams and identifying team leaders, and we're organizing teams based on geographic location and kind of pairing everybody up in the same general area. Gail, do you have any other?
Yeah, for those folks on the phone, you know, we want everybody to sort of get a sense that, you know, we will be organizing teams, and for some of you who are interested and want to volunteer to be team leaders, we would love for you to step up. And just to remind folks on the phone, the responsibility of the team leaders is really to open the conversation, to open the meeting with the ask, to really guide the discussion for these half-hour meetings. Again, close the meeting by restating the ask, be our point person to send a follow-up thank you to either the legislator or the staffer that you met with. And then, of course, if you could send us notes and updates, we do keep all of that information and use that going forward, and we'll use that going forward in the campaign. So we do ask for all of you who are going to be coming and attending visits to do really one simple thing to prepare for that day, and it's just to have a couple of sentences on how housing resources are implemented in the district of the person that you are meeting with and in the community that you are working in or representing. So, you know, this can be how do you use FARE funding in your community, or what would you be able to do if you had more resources like a state housing tax credit. And I really want everybody on the webinar today to remember the one thing that you do not need to do is to become an expert on tax credits. We don't expect that for you. We are going to have prepared talking points, some examples of questions and answers, and you know, we will do that piece of it. So it's really just sort of refining your short, brief story that can really, you know, make an impact of how you are doing really great work in your community with resources. So the schedule of the day is, you know, we're going to have check-in at 9:30. We've built in time in the morning for everybody to meet with their teams in person, so you can do a quick run-through of how you want your meetings to flow, come up with an order of how people want to talk, and that sort of thing. And as Colleen noted, we will be doing legislative visits from 10:30 to noon. We are only scheduling with senators because this legislation is only going to be introduced on the Senate side. We do not have sister legislation going in on the House. from noon to 1, we're going to, again, be providing everybody lunch, and we will have a debrief so you can do a quick report out on what you're hearing and learning in your meetings. At 1 o'clock, we will walk over to the rotunda and have our press conference talking about the legislation. Senator Killian will be there. And then from 1:30 to 3, we have a block of time where you can do additional legislative visits with your representatives on the House side. We unfortunately are not able to schedule visits at that time, but we strongly encourage any of you who want to meet with your House representatives, if you go ahead and schedule those visits and then you let us know, we at least by May 29th, we would be able to prepare some customized local packets for you. Again, we strongly encourage you to meet with your representatives. We're just, again, in our efforts, going to be scheduling only on the Senate side in the mornings. But we will have extra packets on hand for anybody who does want to meet with any of their House representatives. There will also be one of our sponsors, the National Housing Trust, would like to do some interviews and get stories and testimonials about the good work that you all have been doing in your communities and really addressing this affordable housing crisis and making housing safe, decent, and affordable and within reach of all Pennsylvanians. So with this, let's do a brief tutorial on really how to have an effective legislative visit. As I said earlier, your team leader is going to open the meeting with the reason you're visiting. Everyone's going to go around, introduce yourself, state why they're there at the meeting, why this issue is important to them. The team leader will tell the staff or the legislator what the group is asking for, what our ask is, and our ask is going to be for the senator to co-sponsor legislation. You're going to have hold a conversation around these issues, and this is sort of where the homework comes in, thinking about what are those few sentences that you've crafted to really get the point across of why we need more resources in Pennsylvania for affordable housing. And then your team leader will close the meeting, restate the ask, and make sure to say thank you to the staff or legislator for their time and support. So this is our messaging framework for that conversation. You know, even with the great programs and policies in place, like the State Housing Trust Fund and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, we can and we should do more. The housing gap continues to grow in Pennsylvania, and across the state there are only 38 affordable units available for every 100 extremely low-income rental households. In your packets, we are going to actually have that number by county. Our next point is these programs and policies are making it possible for people like to get back on their feet. And this is, again, really where you insert that story that you've been working on, those few sentences that really put the human face onto this issue about how really getting access to good quality, safe housing can be transformational for some folks. And we know the solutions that work. So we really just need to bring more resources so we can bring those solutions to scale. Again, the team leaders will send thank yous and update the Housing Alliance, but also know the work is far from done at the end of Home Matters Day. Everybody on the phone, please know we would like to continue to partner with you when it comes to making phone calls, doing letters to the editor, doing in-district visits. All of these activities are going to be coming up in the very near future. So again, we have our next steps. Prepare that story. We are going to be sending out an email asking folks on the phone or on the webinar today to go ahead and call your senator. We want to make sure that people are hearing about this even before Home Matters Day, so that when you are bringing up the ask in the meeting, it's not the first time they're hearing about it. We want to make sure that it's just something that's been percolating for a while. And with that, are there any questions or anything like that from folks on the phone?
Gail, before we open up to questions, can I just talk quickly about the National Housing Trust?
Yes.
Sorry. So just one more quick thing. I wanted to thank our sponsors. We have 2 sponsors this year. And I wanted to highlight the National Housing Trust, who are, Ty is on the phone with us right now because they're doing a really exciting program where they're going to be telling the stories of people who either have lived experience with homelessness or who currently live in affordable housing. So Ty, do you want to jump in and talk about how that's going to work and how that's going to play into our Home Matters Day?
Yeah, sure thing. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm Ty Coates from the National Housing Trust. I'm part of our team that's currently doing the Where Will We Live campaign, which basically highlights just the importance of funding affordable housing and also lifting up the voices of our residents who are living in affordable housing or have lived in affordable housing. We're going to be there on Home Matters Day collecting stories, I believe from 12 to 4, if that's correct. Yes. So essentially, we would just love to hear from anybody who has lived in affordable housing, has been involved with affordable housing, to just ultimately, just kind of take that story and hopefully bring it forth to our legislators and other policymakers so that way they can understand what all is going on. And so we have highlighted different stories, whether it's been like residents who have gone from working for the U.S. military to immigrating here, to single mothers, to people who were homeless or people whose houses got taken over by like a sinkhole in Florida. So literally we are taking any stories, but we'll be there with a booth to just talk to anybody who's interested. And we can pretty much go from there.
Great. Thank you, Ty, and thank you guys so much for supporting this day. So just really quickly on the logistics of this, there will be a video crew at Home Matters Day in a room in the State House. And for folks who want to tell their stories on video, and that the National Housing Trust will then promote nationally through their websites and will also show to members of Congress. You can go make an appointment during the day and go and take the video while we're in Harrisburg. So you'll be getting an email with details about how this is going to be done, and folks from National Housing Trust and Housing Alliance will be reaching out to those of you who registered. We just wanted to make everyone aware that we're doing this on Home Matters Day as well, and we're really looking forward to hearing everyone's story who wants to tell it. So thanks again, and now I will reopen the floor for more questions. And I also see there are some questions in the chat, so I will respond to those. So Colleen, I think you're going to unmute the line so people can ask questions.
Sure.
So just, oops,
the conference has been unmuted.
Can I ask a question about a local collaborative?
Sure.
Hello. Yeah, this is Jill Bartoli. I'm from Carlisle. We started NOAA, and we're thinking because we're a small town, and there are lots of people who have expertise in building and rehab and care about the whole issue, that we'd like to build a community-wide kind of plan to use the funding that would typically go to a larger housing collaborative or a larger housing. I forget what they call them exactly. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So rather than bringing someone in from the outside who's going to spend a whole lot of money to do something for us, the idea is for us to do it together.
Right.
But what does that look like when you talk about the low-income tax credits and PHARE funding?
Well, so I think the thing to do with some other communities that have done something similar.
Yeah, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry.
Your phone. There's a lot of.
So I think Colleen, can you please mute the line?
The conference has been muted.
To operate this in your community.
Lavana, you were just muted for a minute. If you could just restart your answer for Jill.
Sure. So, Jill, I think that the best thing to do would be to connect you with other groups that have done this in smaller communities around the state, and to learn about how they have formed collaboratives to apply either for PHARE funding or tax credits, because there have been communities that have successfully done that. Many of them have done it through land banks, but also through other types of community collaboratives. But in the same way that the groups can apply to PHFA for tax credits and PHARE funding now, the state housing tax credit will also be administered through that system. So to respond to how it would work for a community collaborative, you would apply for tax credits and funding through PHFA and the QAP process. But we can talk offline about different structures that you can put in place in your community that would work.
Since the lines are muted, I just wanted to mention to unmute your phone, you can hit *7 and ask your question.
I just wanted to say I love that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
This is Gail. I have a question for Matt. So hopefully you can unmute yourself. But when it comes to the state housing tax credit, I see that it's layered with the low-income housing tax credit. Is it possible for a project to receive the state housing tax credit if it had not received and been awarded a low-income housing tax credit?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So the short answer is there's nothing prohibiting the issuing of state credits without federal credits, but I think that will be a PHFA decision as it decides how it wants to leverage its funds the best way it can.
Mm-hmm.
So I've definitely heard of projects receiving state credits, and this is in other states that have allocations of state credits. I've definitely heard of projects only getting state credits, but I cannot say it's definitely not typical, but there's nothing prohibiting it.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so if folks have more questions, since the unmuting all the lines didn't work, you can press *7 to unmute yourself and chime in with a question, or you can also type questions into the chat.
if there's a question for me, I can only see the answers, not the questions. So let me know.
Okay. I'm not seeing any for you right now, Matt. Thank you. Oh, so I'm sorry. I just saw a question from Craig asking why there is no sister or House bill. What we expect to happen, Craig, is that the Senate bill would pass out of the Senate, and then that bill will actually be considered by the House. It does make the process a little bit less confusing so that there's no conflict between a House and a Senate bill. That, of course, is subject to change, but that's what we're expecting to happen right now.
I see a question here that says, how do we speak about the myth that Section 8 housing is just another form of welfare?
I did. I was actually just writing in a response to that, but just to answer it for the group. I think that question kind of reflects a more general, difficult question that we all face when doing this type of work about why should, I have to pay for someone else to have stable housing, food, medical care, the list goes on and on. And I think in general, the best answer to that question is that when families and individuals are stably housed, we know that it actually benefits entire communities. So the bigger question is, how do we want to live in community, and do we want to live in a place where people have the basic needs that they need in order to live their lives with dignity met? Because when that happens, we all benefit. The economy benefits. It creates jobs. Children are more stable in their schools. People are more able to become self-sufficient. And overall, we know this is true from our lived experience and also from the data. So, the one thing I'll say as a caveat to that is sometimes when you get that question, it might mean that person or that legislator is not persuadable, because if they have that sort of perspective, it can be more difficult to persuade them. But I think that the best way to answer those types of questions is to focus on how these benefits, while our, obviously help that individual family or individual person, really what we're doing is we're supporting entire communities.
Can I just add to that? I've been up on the Hill, not in Pennsylvania, but in Washington and in Albany. I think the first thing I like to say and really hammer home is we are not talking about Section 8 housing with this tax credit. There is nothing that precludes any of these landlords from taking Section 8 vouchers, but we are not talking about concentrated Section 8, project-based Section 8 housing. We are talking about housing for people between 30 and 80% of AMI. That's working people. And so, I like to make that absolutely clear. This is not public housing. And people hear, low-income housing and tax credits, and they assume we're talking about new public housing projects. This is not that. And then the second thing I would say, because, again, when I speak to people on both sides of the aisle, the other important part to hammer home, I think, is the leverage aspect of this. This is taking public funds and then leveraging private capital from the private market to build housing. And so, there is a multiplier effect there, and it's real. Those two things, I think, combined can go a long way towards moving the conversation away from the tenants. The tenants in any of these projects are going to be as good as the manager and the sponsor. Period.
May I ask one more question about that?
Sure.
So what do you say to people that say, well, they just get these low-income houses and they can keep them for life, and then there are all these other people who have no access at all? So, I mean, I live out here in Republican land.
No, I hear you.
Cumberland
And, hey, I live in Buffalo, which is very much a purple place, right?
Yeah.
And it's right on the Pennsylvania border, so it's very culturally similar.
Yeah.
So,
So I don't know the details about the number of years people keep Section 8 housing, or they would keep the housing that, you're talking about.
This isn't Section 8 housing, right? And so Section 8, to get a Section 8 voucher, you have to go to your Section 8 issuer, which is often a housing authority, and get on a waiting list, which can approach 8 to 10 years in some places.
Right.
This is not that, right? But the answer to that question is, the idea of initial occupancy, people have to be at or below 60 to 80% AMI, whatever you go in and apply for your project to be, right? I'm sorry about those noises. All of my calendars are going crazy. So we're now I just lost my thought.
They would be at or below the income.
Oh, yeah.
Income,
They'll be the idea that here is to create permanent, stable communities. So the idea that the day someone makes 60% AMI plus $1, they get booted out and are now under a rent burden somewhere is not what anybody is trying to accomplish here. In a tax credit project, the initial occupancy, the tenants have to have to be eligible, and they do have to certify their income annually. And if somebody moves out, if someone moves out, that apartment has to be re-rented to an income eligible tenant. But people are not kicked out as soon as they get a job that pays them more money. That would be making this a short-term motel and not a stable community asset.
Mm-hmm. And Jill, I think the broader question is sort of, getting at a values issue. And so we wouldn't want to throw Section 8 folks under the bus or anything like that, because certainly plenty of the groups on the call here work with people to help them get Section 8 vouchers because it's a great tool to help families and individuals. But I think that the bigger question is, someone's basically asking you a question about, do they value helping someone get into stable housing? And I think the better way to answer that is kind of what we're getting at the end here, which is helping people get back on their feet is good for the entire community. And that's what these tools do, and that creates a long-term sustainable economy where everyone can benefit. And that's what we're trying to do.
Okay. Thanks. It's just hard to field some of the questions that come at you from very Republican legislators that we have around here. So,
right. And I think that a lot of Republicans do agree with the idea of helping people become self-sustainable. I think some of the mechanisms have, been diminished in their view, and we just have to help them reframe that idea.
And don't give up. And I just, as an aside, right, we turned then Senator Brown back into a champion of LISC, right? So it can happen. All right, it can certainly happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
All right, we have a few more minutes. Does anyone else have any other questions? I just want to note that Craig mentioned that we should send out the PowerPoint, and we definitely plan to do that. We're going to actually send out the recording of this entire call, and everyone will be able to access it as we move forward, and that will go out over email in the near future.
And can I make one more quick point on all of this? I think the other, and just because I have a lot of ideas about this in my head, the other thing I like to focus on, this is a primary driver of production for senior housing and for veterans housing, and those are two things that people on both sides of the aisle perk up when you say pretty immediately. So keep that in your head. If you look through the projects that PHFA have awarded, I think you'll see a substantial portion go to supportive housing projects, elderly projects. A substantial portion of HUD's properties are regulated 202s, which are all senior projects, right? So there are ways to kind of enhance the discussion of the projects that we're talking about here beyond just I don't like low income tenants. They're everyone knows somebody that lives in one of these projects.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, that's great. I'll just remind everyone one more time, *7 if you want to unmute yourself. We'll give just a few more minutes. And then, Colleen, are there any other closing details that you want to add?
No, our Dale's and I's contact information is on this slide, so if you do have any other questions about Home Matters Day and anything leading up to Home Matters Day, feel free to reach out to us and we'll answer your questions.
And again, if you're interested in being a team leader, please reach out to us right away. Also, if you want to go ahead and schedule your own visits with your representatives on the House side, again, if you let us know at least a week in advance, we can make a customized packet for that particular legislator.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone joining us today, and we will continue to follow up with folks, and you'll be getting an email for the first action, which is to reach out to your senators and ask them in advance to co-sponsor the legislation, and as well as the recording of this conference and the PowerPoint.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.